They wore crowns, gave speeches, and waved from balconies. But behind the palace walls, many royal lives unraveled with a whisper and a bottle. This isn't the story of scandal. It's the story of sedation, of monarchs and princesses medicated into silence with opium, morphine, barbiturates, and something worse, obedience. For centuries, addiction in the royal family wasn't hidden. It was prescribed. This is the untold history of 25 British royals and the dangerous drugs that kept the monarchy upright and quietly unraveling. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe if you love deep, dark dives into the hidden corners of history. It helps us keep peeling back the velvet curtain. And while you're here, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you watching this at 3 a.m. in a hoodie, or mid-commute like a responsible adult? Drop it in the comments. We read every one. 1. George IV. If you looked at George IV in the last years of his life, you'd see a monarch rotting from the inside out, swollen, decadent, and bitter. But even that would be generous. In truth, you'd be staring at a man who had become a vessel for laudanum and regret, with his royal body propped up by powdered wigs, political inertia, and painkillers. You'd be forgiven for thinking the drugs were simply part of the decor. But they weren't. They were the main event. Laudanum, the elegant name for tinctured opium floating in alcohol, was no back-alley vice. In George's world, it came in crystal decanters and was measured out by doctors who wore wigs whiter than his own. They called it a remedy for gout, for melancholy, for nervous troubles. But what it really did was blur time. And George wanted nothing more than to blur the centuries, and maybe himself, into oblivion. He had been in pain for most of his adult life. Some of it was physical. His infamous obesity crushed his joints and turned walking into a theatrical tragedy. But much of it wasn't. George IV was, in many ways, a man raised to hate both himself and his job. He wanted to drink, gamble, and sleep in brocade linens with people who didn't ask questions. Instead, he was expected to govern, expected to be noble, expected to marry women he found loathsome, and produce heirs he didn't like. So, like any self-medicating autocrat with access to an empire's worth of chemicals, George turned to the thing that didn't lecture him. Opium. In drops, in drafts, in vast quantities that left even hardened physicians blinking. One contemporary observer noted that no common mortal could have withstood the daily dosage. And yet George did, or at least his ghost did. The man himself disappeared somewhere between the prescriptions. By the time he reached his 50s, he was almost entirely nocturnal. His body was so bloated he couldn't close his eyes fully, and his skin erupted in ulcers that no amount of rosewater could hide. He couldn't walk upstairs. He couldn't eat without opiates. He couldn't sleep without them either. This wasn't the kind of addiction that hid in the shadows. It was seated on the throne. But of course nobody called it that. In the polite language of the court, he was delicate, ailing, beset by infirmities. Even as he became a walking apothecary of alkaloids and ether, the official line was one of constitutional concern, not personal collapse. After all, if the king was just a man in pain, what did that say about the divine right of kings? The more interesting question, though, is what it says about pain. Because George IV wasn't just medicating an illness. He was medicating a contradiction, the impossible gap between royal image and human suffering. He was the personification of empire and excess, of powdered dignity stretched thin over human desperation. And the laudanum? It was the only thing keeping that illusion stitched together. By the end, the dosage was no longer shocking. It was expected. The real shock was how long it took for anyone to admit that George had been chemically dissolving for decades. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory. He went out under a pile of velvet, opium, and polite denial. And yet, as the royal physician signed off on one more necessary measure, as the monarchy quietly repositioned itself for the next act, There was one man in the shadows who didn't flinch at the opium bottles or the ruined king. His name was Prince George, Duke of Kent, and unlike his namesake, he wouldn't hide his relationship with drugs behind velvet curtains. He'd wear it like a scandal, one silver syringe at a time. 2. Prince George, Duke of Kent. In the hushed corridors of royal scandal, few figures flicker quite as enigmatically as Prince George, Duke of Kent. The fourth son of George V, younger brother to two kings, Edward VIII and George VI, and the only senior royal to die on active service in the 20th century, Prince George lived like a mystery novel left open mid-sentence. He was a royal, a naval officer, a diplomat, a father, a rumor magnate, and, as the whispers insist, an addict. Now the word addict is not one you'll find inscribed on any marble statue or tucked into official biographies. What you will find, though, is a trail of remarks, memoirs, and shadowed side-eyes from contemporaries who knew him not as a polished prince but as a man tangled up in contradictions. Tall, charming, dangerously elegant, he seemed designed not just to live in high society, but to undo it from within. The story usually begins in the 1920s, when George, then a young officer with an appetite for nightlife, fell into the most dangerous kind of crowd. Aristocrats who'd stopped pretending they were sober. Among them was the infamous Kiki Preston, an American socialite so synonymous with self-destruction that she earned the nickname the girl with the silver syringe. Kiki didn't hide her preferences. She flaunted them at parties the way others flaunted pearls. And according to more than a few accounts, she and Prince George were inseparable. That pairing alone would raise eyebrows. But what made it truly radioactive was the suggestion, repeated with unnerving consistency, that both were using morphine and cocaine with regularity, not occasionally, not recreationally, but ritually, as the champagne accompaniment to a life that was trying very hard not to feel like one. It's not hard to see how George got there. He had been raised in one of the most emotionally rigid environments imaginable, the royal household of George V, a place where affection was rationed like coal and vulnerability was an affront to the crown. As a boy, George had longed to be a pianist, a designer, even a monk. But what he was allowed to be was useful. He was trained to be useful. And when he wasn't, he was sent to the Navy. Drifting through assignments in the diplomatic corps, shadowing royal duties, George often found himself without a fixed identity. And it was there, in the liminal space between duty and desire, that he found a different kind of clarity, one distilled in a syringe. Like so many members of the 1920s upper crust, he inhabited a cultural twilight. One foot in the decaying rituals of empire, the other in the roaring chaos of modernity. And when the two clashed, the only consistent thing left was the high. Of course, it was never officially acknowledged. The British monarchy doesn't do confessions. It does silence. But the rumors hung heavy. His older brother Edward VIII, no stranger to reputational storms, reportedly made oblique comments about George's vices. Palace insiders privately spoke of his delicate health, and by the 1930s, George was increasingly shielded from public life, ostensibly due to service commitments. What no one said aloud, but everyone seemed to know, was that George had grown dependent on substances the crown refused to name. Then came the war, the only real escape hatch for scandalous royals. Prince George joined the Royal Air Force, returning to active duty with a kind of fervor that raised questions. Was it patriotism? A bid for redemption? Or just another distraction from the chaos within? His death in 1942, in a mysterious plane crash in Scotland, did nothing to quiet the speculations. The crash report was sealed for decades. There were inconsistencies in the passenger list. A royal on a secret mission with a skeleton crew? It sounded less like an accident and more like a cover story. And yet, the man himself remained elusive. A prince of shadows who danced at cabarets in Paris, sang opera in Vienna, and sat glassy-eyed at country estates, caught between morphine reveries and royal obligation. He died young, yes. But the tragedy wasn't just that he died. It was that he never quite got to live on his own terms. He was a man carved up by class, convention, and chemical coping mechanisms, too modern for the monarchy, too royal for freedom. But his story wasn't a one-off. Because the truth is, drug dependence in the royal family didn't start with George IV or end with Prince George. It seeped through generations, sometimes quietly, sometimes with gossip as loud as cannon fire. And for one Victorian princess, a woman born into privilege but boxed in by nerves and nerves alone, the answer to her suffering came in the form of a golden brown tincture. Its name? Laudanum. Its grip? Lifelong. Her name was Helena. If you've made it this far, you're clearly one of us. The curious, the night thinkers, the ones who wonder what really happened behind the palace doors. So go ahead and subscribe. Not just for the algorithm, but so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're here, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it? Midnight in Manchester? 6 a.m. in Manila? Let us know in the comments. We see you. 3. Princess Helena. If you wanted to understand Victorian medicine, you could start with a bottle of laudanum. You'd find it everywhere. In ladies' dressing tables, in the bedside cabinets of dukes, in the nursery, in the doctor's case. And if you happen to be Princess Helena, the daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, it would become the quiet companion to your nerves, your insomnia, your migraines, your grief, your everything. It was not a scandal, not even a secret. It was medicine, they said. But by the end, it was more than that. It was a dependency the era mistook for decorum. Princess Helena was not the rebellious one. That role belonged to her sisters. She wasn't the glamorous one, nor the brilliant one. She was the dutiful daughter, the loyal attendant, the one who stayed close to her mother long after her sisters had married out of the palace. She embroidered, translated books, wrote letters, and performed the kind of quiet obedience Queen Victoria adored. And yet, even duty can ache. Helena suffered from what her physicians called nervous disorders, the vague catch-all of Victorian diagnosis, covering everything from anxiety to chronic fatigue to despair. Enter laudanum, the period's liquid comfort. 1 drop soothed the nerves. 2 drops brought sleep. A spoonful made the world mercifully distant. It was a solution so simple that no one questioned the problem anymore. For Helena, who lived in a world where emotional restraint was law and sensitivity a sin, laudanum was not rebellion. It was survival. We know she used it because everyone in her circle did. The diaries, the letters, the memoirs all point to the same pattern. Noble women dissolving their pain into amber liquid. Doctors prescribed it for migraines, menstrual discomfort, grief, hysteria, and, more conveniently, the vague anxiety that came from being constantly watched and never heard. The polite term was restorative. The truth was that they were all a little bit sedated. Helena's life was quietly tragic in a way that fits the Victorian mold, not in catastrophe, but in containment. She married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, a match Queen Victoria approved mainly because it kept her daughter near. Her husband was older, mild, and dull enough not to threaten the Queen's emotional monopoly. The marriage was one of those strategic arrangements that worked precisely because neither party expected joy. Helena became the nurse, translator, and domestic manager of her mother's later years. But even queens can drain their caretakers dry. She endured chronic pain, back, joint, and neural, worsened by pregnancies and the suffocating expectations of the court. Each prescription of laudanum came as reassurance. Take this, it will help you rest. And it did, for a time. Then the rest required more of the same. The addictive circle was elegant, invisible. Doctors didn't warn their patients about dependency. They refilled bottles with the same efficiency with which they delivered condolences. For Helena, the drug became a background hum, a soft fog through which she managed her duties, her family, and her fading energy. By the late 19th century, British society was beginning to notice that half its upper class seemed permanently drowsy. The newspapers published nervous editorials about the laudanum habit, mostly in reference to poets, artists, and fallen women, never princesses. But the symptoms were the same: the tremors, the fatigue, the need for increasing doses to achieve the same calm. If Helena's physicians noticed, they kept their silence. She was, after all, a royal patient. Royals didn't succumb to addiction. They suffered from delicate health. Her correspondence in later life reads like the writings of a woman suspended between numbness and endurance. She wrote often of headaches, of feeble spirits, of long nights of wakefulness that only her tonic could touch. Her friends described her as pale and kind, the sort of description that conceals as much as it reveals. Pain was simply part of the decorum of womanhood. And laudanum, the secret sacrament of empire, made sure the suffering stayed quiet. In the end, Helena lived a long life, outlasting the age that had defined her. She died in 1923, in a world that had discovered Freud, radio, and jazz. A world in which laudanum had been replaced by morphine, and then by more modern sedatives. But her story is a perfect echo of her time. A woman who was allowed every comfort except emotional honesty. A woman medicated into silence because silence was expected. And perhaps that's the real mystery. That entire generations of royal women were treated not as people but as fragile ornaments, their discomforts dosed until they disappeared. And when one of them refused to disappear, when she lit her cigarettes with rebellion and her insomnia with nightlife, the palace didn't quite know what to do with her, because she wasn't quiet, she wasn't gentle, and she certainly wasn't pale. Her name was Princess Margaret. 4. Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret did not come from a time when royalty still believed in divine right. She came from something trickier, the age of performance. Cameras were everywhere, tabloids were oxygen, and the royal family had begun to transition from symbols of imperial grandeur to curated characters in an ongoing national drama. The trouble was, Margaret never quite wanted the part. She was born in 1930, 4 years after Edward VIII, and long after anyone believed monarchs healed the sick by touch. She was the younger sister, the beautiful one, the sparkling one. The party royal, they said, with an edge of admiration and a great deal of coded disapproval. Where Elizabeth projected duty, Margaret radiated danger, or at least discomfort. She laughed too loudly, smoked too often, and spoke as if she'd already read your private diary and judged your taste in wallpaper. Beneath all that confidence was a body that didn't sleep. Margaret, even as a child, suffered from what doctors referred to as restlessness. A polite term for insomnia, perhaps, or anxiety, or the kind of psychological static that comes from being constantly scrutinized but never actually seen. By the time she was in her 30s, the struggle for rest had gone from nuisance to crisis. It was the 1970s, and Margaret's life was cracking at the edges. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, the first commoner to marry a king's daughter in over 400 years, had begun with passion and ended with bitterness. The divorce proceedings were not yet official, but the press knew. Everyone knew. Her image, once flirtatiously defiant, now sagged under layers of judgment. And Margaret, the woman who had danced with the Rolling Stones and joked with Noel Coward, was exhausted. Enter the pills. Nitrazepam, to be specific, a heavy-duty sedative sold under the brand name Mogadon. Prescribed in many countries as a short-term solution to insomnia, it works by dulling the central nervous system. For most patients, it induces sleep. For some, it induces dependency. For Margaret, it induced both. We know about this not from scandal sheets, but from serious reports. In the late 1970s, during one of her separations from Armstrong Jones, Margaret reportedly overdosed on sleeping pills. The palace denied it was deliberate, and perhaps it wasn't. The more disturbing possibility is that she simply lost track, that the pills had become background noise, another accessory to an exhausting life. There were warnings, of course. Mogadon was not a harmless pill. It came with foggy mornings, memory gaps, and the need for ever higher doses. But like laudanum a century before, it had the sheen of medical legitimacy. A doctor's signature could make anything sound reasonable. And Margaret, though rebellious, was not immune to the institutional voice of medicine. She continued to use sedatives throughout her life. Friends noted how often she canceled engagements due to fatigue. Interviews from the 1990s captured a woman with charm but frayed edges, slower to speak, quicker to irritate. She lived on the island of Moustique for months at a time, surrounded by friends, servants, and distance. And always there was the subtext. Sleep was something she chased, and like many before her, she had enlisted chemistry in the chase. But Princess Margaret's story is different from her predecessors. She wasn't quietly dosed by court physicians or hidden away in a palace drawing room. She was a modern figure, photographed, scrutinized, and slowly unraveling in the public eye. Her relationship with pills wasn't a private vice. It was a symptom of something everyone saw but few truly addressed: the human cost of performance. Because when the palace closes its gates at night, the costumes come off, but the expectations don't. Royals aren't allowed to be fragile, only flawed in ways the tabloids can monetize. Margaret, too smart to play the saint, too tired to keep fighting, opted instead for a kind of glamorous retreat. But the body keeps score. The nervous system, no matter how royal, doesn't lie. And Margaret was far from the first monarch to learn that too late. Her ancestor, George III, once known as Mad, had also tried to medicate his way out of pain. Only his prescriptions came in a bottle labeled laudanum, and in doses measured not by milligrams, but by imperial hubris. 5. George III. The official portrait of George III is all posture and polish, powdered hair, gold embroidery, the cold weight of kingship stitched into every thread. He is remembered mostly as the monarch who lost America and his mind in roughly the same historical breath. But behind the caricature of a raving lunatic shouting at trees or talking to invisible people, behind all the shorthand madness, was something less theatrical and more familiar. A man in pain, fed laudanum by the drop, decade after decade, until the line between treatment and torment vanished completely. The madness of King George III is still debated. Historians have offered retroactive diagnoses ranging from porphyria to bipolar disorder to arsenic poisoning. But whatever the cause, one fact is clear: the treatment made everything worse. Because this was 18th century medicine, an era in which opium was not a last resort but a first instinct, and George, unlucky soul that he was, had the full weight of the royal physician's confidence behind every dosage. Records show that throughout his illnesses, George III was routinely given laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. 30 drops here, a larger draft there, always described in medical shorthand that sounds reassuring until you realize how little they understood about what they were prescribing. Laudanum wasn't used with caution. It was used like wallpaper, slathered over every symptom until the patient either calmed down or stopped responding. Either outcome was seen as success. But George wasn't just another nobleman with a bottle by his bedside. He was the king. His episodes of illness, whether mental, neurological, or metabolic, were national events, which meant his treatment was as much about optics as it was about recovery. When he became agitated or erratic, when his speech grew pressured or his sleep disappeared, the solution was sedation. Dignified sedation, of course. Velvet curtained, professionally administered, and thoroughly documented. But sedation nonetheless. This wasn't an age that understood mental health. Royal doctors didn't talk about trauma or neurochemistry. They talked about humors, vapors, and bad bile. When those ideas failed, they reached for stronger potions, and in George's case, they reached over and over again for decades. By the time he entered the final phase of his life, blind, deaf, and largely incoherent, his mind was considered lost. His treatment, however, never changed. The laudanum kept coming. The sleep it induced was the only peace anyone expected anymore. What's rarely discussed is the deeper irony, that the very drug used to quiet his distress may have prolonged or even deepened it. Chronic opium use, especially in patients with underlying neurological issues, can amplify confusion, worsen mood swings, and disrupt cognition. In modern terms, George may have been trapped in a chemical fog his doctors mistook for healing. He wasn't recovering. He was being preserved in a half-functioning state, medically tranquilized for public consumption. And while history remembers him with a mixture of pity and parody, the Mad King who babbled through revolutions, there's something darker at play. George's addiction wasn't personal in the way we think of it now. It wasn't secretive or shameful. It was clinical, institutional, administered by men in powdered wigs with Latin titles. He was, in a sense, the royal prototype for an idea that would echo for generations, that suffering must be subdued, not understood. George III's legacy is complicated: constitutional reformer, cultural patron, imperial disappointment. But beneath all of that is a cautionary tale about the invisible prisons we build around pain. His life was ruled not just by parliament and policy, but by a bottle of opium tincture quietly doing its work in the shadows. And long before him, another royal, a queen this time, had been taking that very same drug in a preparation even more poetic and more unsettling. They called it laudanum on toast floating in brandy. The Queen? Anne. The diagnosis? Pain. The prescription? Numbness, elegantly served. 6. Queen Anne. Queen Anne lived in a time when the monarchy was still wrapped in sacred mythology, an era where kings and queens were thought to carry divine blood and, occasionally, supernatural endurance. But Anne, by every account, was deeply, painfully human. Her reign was heavy with war, succession crises, and fragile alliances. Her body was heavier still, not just from her infamous weight, but from decades of physical agony, personal grief, and what we now recognize as profound emotional strain. The solution to all of it, of course, came in a teacup laced with poison disguised as medicine. Laudanum, they called it. But what they were offering was silence. Anne was queen from 1702 to 1714, but long before she wore the crown, she was suffering. By the time she ascended the throne, she had endured a staggering number of pregnancies, at least 17, nearly all of which ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or the early death of the child. Her only son to survive infancy, William, died at age 11. In the emotionally corseted world of early 18th century monarchy, Anne was expected to grieve with grace and continue ruling. There were no therapists, only tinctures. We know that Anne's physicians administered laudanum, sometimes infused in wine or floated on toast soaked in brandy. A detail that sounds whimsical if you don't know what laudanum is. But make no mistake, this wasn't a treat. It was a pharmaceutical tranquilizer. And she took it not occasionally, but regularly. For her nervous complaints, for her chronic gout, for her insomnia, her melancholy, and likely for the grief that clung to her like a crown she never wanted. Court records and private medical notes suggest that Anne's drug use was fully endorsed by her attending physicians. Laudanum was not seen as dangerous. It was seen as civilized, especially for women, and especially for queens. Pain was seen as inconvenient, and emotion as destabilizing. The job of medicine was not to heal so much as to pacify. Laudanum allowed Anne to continue performing her role while the reality of her life was slowly dissolving under the weight of illness, bereavement, and political obligation. The irony, of course, is that she was one of the most politically significant monarchs of her century. Under her rule, the kingdoms of England and Scotland were united into Great Britain. The War of the Spanish Succession shaped the balance of power in Europe for decades. And yet, at home, Anne was often seen as indecisive, overly reliant on favorites, and emotionally volatile. What the court saw as moodiness may have been something closer to side effects, of grief, of exhaustion, or of chronic opiate use. The laudanum didn't erase her pain. It merely pressed it into the background, like bad wallpaper no one wants to acknowledge. Her correspondence reveals someone with deep affections and deep wounds. Letters to confidants like Sarah Churchill and Abigail Masham are filled with emotional swings, earnest longing, and veiled desperation. Laudanum didn't solve any of it. It just blurred the edges. Anne's body eventually gave out. By the time of her death in 1714, she was in her late 40s, swollen with edema, racked with joint inflammation, and barely able to move without assistance. Physicians of the era described her as broken, but they said it with the detachment of men who'd watched it happen by inches. The Queen had been dissolving before their eyes for years, but she never made a scene. The medicine made sure of that. What remains is the ghost of a woman who held a fractured kingdom together while her own body fell apart. She was not a monarch who raged. She was one who endured, softly, chemically, invisibly, and her legacy, of pain muted by chemistry, didn't end with her, because decades later, another monarch would pick up where she left off. This time a queen with a famously unamused expression and a bottle of chloroform in her birthing chamber. Her name was Victoria. Her choice was anesthesia. And once again, the royal body would become a battleground between tradition, medicine, and the quiet desperation for relief. 7. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was not the kind of woman who liked to appear weak. She ruled over an empire where the sun famously never set, and she did it with the conviction of someone who believed, or at least pretended to believe, that moral rectitude could bend the course of history. She was sharp, stubborn, and ferociously private, which made her public experiment with early anesthesia all the more striking. Because when Victoria accepted chloroform during childbirth, not once but twice, she wasn't just seeking relief. She was setting off a national panic about what it meant for a monarch, a mother, a moral symbol, to embrace chemical surrender. Let's pause here. Chloroform isn't an opiate, technically. It doesn't come from poppies. It doesn't mimic the body's endorphins. But it belongs to the same family of substances that blur pain, suppress consciousness, and raise very uncomfortable questions about control. And in mid-19th century Britain, that was more than enough to make it controversial. When Queen Victoria gave birth to her 8th child, Prince Leopold, in 1853, she became the most famous patient of Dr. John Snow, the same man who would later be hailed as the father of modern epidemiology. Snow was pioneering the use of chloroform as a general anesthetic, and he had developed a special method of administration. A folded cloth over the mouth and nose, carefully timed inhalations, and a precise withdrawal before the drug could induce deep unconsciousness. In other words, he walked the Queen right up to the edge of oblivion and then brought her back. It worked. The Queen reportedly described the experience as soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. No one had ever heard her use that kind of language about childbirth before. But rather than universal acclaim, the response was a frenzy of moral anxiety. The medical establishment was split. Religious leaders declared it unnatural. Some critics claimed it was unseemly for a monarch, especially a female monarch, to partake in something so modern, so mechanical, so chemical. After all, wasn't pain part of divine punishment? Part of the maternal role? Part of what made queens, well, queens? Victoria didn't care. She used chloroform again 4 years later when giving birth to her 9th child, Princess Beatrice. This time, the protests were quieter. The precedent had been set. Women across the country began asking their doctors for what the Queen had. And even though the use of anesthesia in childbirth remained controversial for decades, the myth of royal immunity to pain had been punctured. And not by accident, by design. But here's the thing. Victoria didn't just use chloroform and move on. She used medicine in many forms throughout her life, with a documented reliance on proprietary tonics, sedatives, and the late Victorian pharmacopoeia that flooded the upper classes with everything from bromides to opiates under genteel branding. She wasn't known to be addicted exactly, but she was of an age where the line between medical use and dependence was negotiable. By the end of her reign, Victoria had witnessed the evolution of medicine from superstition to science, and had personally sampled its most morally divisive tools. She lived through a time when doctors still wrote prescriptions in Latin and when women's complaints were treated with chemical quietude. Whether or not she knew it, she had become a kind of ambassador for medicinal control, not through rebellion, but through respectable participation. It's tempting to see her chloroform episode as a footnote in a long life, but it marked something more significant. The moment when the royal body, always symbolic, always scrutinized, openly admitted that it needed help, that pain was not always sacred, that chemistry might be preferable to suffering. And in doing so, she gave permission, however accidentally, for a new era of royal medicine, one that wouldn't always end well. Because before Victoria had her children drugged into the world, there was another princess, one who never made it past the birthing chamber. Her name was Charlotte. Her story was tragedy wrapped in protocol. And the drugs? They came late, or not at all. 8. Princess Charlotte of Wales. By the time Princess Charlotte of Wales went into labor in 1817, the British public had already decided she would save the monarchy. She was the only legitimate grandchild of George III, the presumed heir to the throne, and a rare royal who seemed genuinely beloved. The newspapers called her spirited. The people called her hope. And the palace? Well, the palace called in the doctors. Her pregnancy was watched with a mix of giddy anticipation and trembling calculation. Britain had spent the better part of a generation lurching from scandal to scandal, and Charlotte, young, intelligent, and married to the sober-minded Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, was seen as the fresh start. Her child, the child of reform and restraint, would be the future. But Charlotte's fate was sealed not by the politics of her lineage, but by the medicine of her time. And in that room, on the night of her labor, the real danger wasn't a lack of care. It was the kind of care she received. Obstetrics in the early 19th century was not so much a science as a set of traditions, and one of those traditions was restraint, especially when it came to intervention. Princess Charlotte's physicians, led by the fashionable and famously conservative Sir Richard Croft, chose a minimal drug approach. No forceps, no opium early in labor, nothing really to disturb the natural process. Laudanum and its cousins were on hand, of course. This was a royal birth. But they weren't used in the aggressive ways we might expect. The guiding philosophy was caution. What unfolded instead was something closer to catastrophe. Her labor lasted over 50 hours. The stillborn baby boy, a child whose birth had been heralded for months in the press, arrived first. Charlotte, exhausted, developed complications shortly after. By morning, she was dead. The news stunned the nation. Bells tolled, shops closed, people wept openly in the streets. Britain had lost not just a future queen, but a symbolic guarantee of continuity. And they'd lost her in the one place she should have been safest, under the care of the crown's most trusted medical minds. Those minds, it turns out, had been so determined not to over-medicate her that they'd effectively undertreated her into a grave. The medical autopsy, both public and private, was brutal. Sir Richard Croft, already a man of frayed nerves, was vilified. He would die by suicide months later, driven to despair by the backlash. But amid the public fury, few focused on the strange irony at the heart of the story. Charlotte, unlike so many of her female ancestors, had not been heavily sedated. She had not been lulled into chemical silence. And yet, Her death was arguably one of the clearest cases of royal medical mismanagement in the 19th century. Her story doesn't quite fit the arc of addiction. She wasn't drugged into oblivion or quietly dependent on opiates. But what her death does highlight, painfully, unmistakably, is the impossibility of the royal body. Treat it too little and tragedy. Treat it too much and scandal. Prescribe drugs too early and you risk undermining virtue. Prescribe them too late and you bury the future. After Charlotte's death, obstetrics in Britain changed. Pain relief became more common. Interventions less taboo. And when Queen Victoria later accepted chloroform in childbirth, the nation, still haunted by Charlotte, began to soften. Maybe relief wasn't weakness. Maybe suffering wasn't sacred. But that shift didn't come without cost. Charlotte paid the price for a doctrine of restraint. Others, in time, would pay for indulgence. Because not long before Charlotte's final breath, another monarch had faced his own dying days under the weight of Stuart medicine, a symphony of syrups, poultices, and opiates. He was a king with too many physicians and not enough peace. His name was Charles II, and his body would be treated like a battlefield. 9. Charles II. When Charles II began to die, the process was anything but quiet. The year was 1685, and the court erupted into a kind of medical theater, a flurry of wigs, leeches, potions, and powdered urgency. Officially, he had fallen ill quite suddenly. Unofficially, the king had been living on borrowed time for years. A lifetime of excess, political stress, and poor health had finally caught up with him. But rather than confronting the inevitable, his physicians did what royal physicians so often did when faced with mortality. They drowned it in medicine. And, predictably, much of that medicine included opium. Charles had always styled himself a man of appetites, a lover of art, women, wit, and science. He was a Restoration king, the anti-Cromwell, the monarch who made England laugh again after the bleak Puritanism of the interregnum. But there was nothing amusing about the last days of his life. They were a chaotic blend of superstition and science, a tug-of-war between tradition and the early tremors of modern medicine. And in the middle of it all, there was laudanum, or more precisely, a whole category of opiate-based preparations that passed for 17th century pharmaceutical best practice. On February 2, 1685, Charles collapsed during a routine morning ritual. He was seized by what modern historians now believe was likely a stroke or a uremic event related to kidney failure. But 17th century doctors didn't have access to blood tests or imaging. What they had was a logic system built on balance, humors, bile, vapors. If the king was ill, then something inside him needed draining, purging, or sedating. Within the first day of his illness, Charles was bled, not once, but multiple times. Nearly a pint of blood was removed. He was given emetics, purgatives, enemas, herbal tonics, and, of course, opiate compounds. Laudanum and other opium-based sedatives were standard parts of this medicinal blitzkrieg. Their role? To soothe the nerves, calm the brain, or aid sleep. But really, they functioned as royal silence buttons, blunting pain, dulling consciousness, and masking the symptoms no one could explain. Some of these drugs were administered in syrup form, others as tinctures. The exact recipes remain elusive, but the common thread was always opium. Charles, who had once hosted Isaac Newton and patronized the Royal Society, was now being treated with a mix of medieval guesswork and modern chemistry. His body, in effect, became the canvas onto which every possible cure was thrown, until it was no longer clear what was killing him, the illness or the treatment. He died 5 days later, after being subjected to over 50 different remedies. His final words, reportedly delivered with calm resignation, were, "Let not poor Nellie starve," referring to his longtime mistress Nell Gwynn. But beneath the charm was a body overwhelmed, not just by disease, but by medicine administered without mercy. And in all of this, the opium played a quietly sinister role. It didn't draw attention. It didn't cause alarm. It was part of the expected routine. Pain was not considered something to be understood, only neutralized. And if the patient became less lucid in the process, all the better. A quieter monarch was an easier one to manage. What Charles's death reveals is that the monarchy, even then, had no consistent medical philosophy. It had habits, and those habits included flooding the royal body with whatever substance was fashionable, available, or alchemically promising. In Charles's case, that meant opiates in the form of cordial syrups and sleep drafts. Dangerous, yes, but dignified enough to keep up appearances. That formula, pain plus dignity, numbed by chemistry, would return again and again in the centuries that followed, including during the reign of a certain king known for his appetites, his violent temper, and his complicated medical notebooks. He reigned with iron, married 6 times, and was no stranger to the royal pharmacopoeia. His name? Henry VIII. 10. Henry VIII. If ever there was a monarch in need of a personal pharmacist, it was Henry VIII. The Tudor king most famous for dismantling the Catholic Church, collecting wives like chess pieces, and eating his way through the English treasury, was also a man obsessed, some might say consumed, by his own body. And while his reputation for excess tends to focus on the more theatrical elements, banquets, executions, jousts, the quieter truth is that Henry was also a walking cabinet of early modern medicine. Among the many substances in his royal regimen, opiates, not center stage perhaps, but always in the wings, waiting for the cue. This was the 16th century after all, a time when medicine was still a blend of mysticism, alchemy, and guesswork. The line between treatment and ritual was thin, and Henry's court was no exception. He kept an apothecary close at hand, a rotating cast of physicians, and an entire system of remedies catalogued in what historians now call the King's Own Medical Book. A handwritten compendium of recipes, potions, salves, and therapeutic indulgences, it reads less like a medical journal and more like a royal experiment in bodily preservation. At the heart of these recipes were ingredients common to the period: honey, vinegar, rosewater, mercury, lead, and opium. Not opium in isolation, but as part of various preparations designed to dull pain, promote sleep, or calm the mind. Early forms of laudanum hadn't yet become the Victorian household staple, but opiate-based concoctions were still present in Tudor therapeutics, especially among those who could afford the best treatments, or at least the most elaborate ones. For Henry, pain was a lifelong companion. His early years were full of athletic triumphs, hunting, wrestling, jousting, but by midlife, the physical toll had begun to show. He developed chronic ulcers in his legs, which were described as open, festering, and deeply resistant to healing. The royal surgeons tried poultices, cauterization, and binding, but the pain persisted. The remedies became more aggressive. Opiates, often administered as part of complex balms or digestive powders, would have been among the few things that offered consistent, if temporary, relief. But Henry's use of these substances wasn't addiction in the modern sense. It was medicinal dependence, justified, authorized, and culturally sanctioned. The concept of addiction didn't exist yet, at least not in the language of court medicine. What mattered was whether the king could function. Could he walk to council, sit through mass, yell at a diplomat? Then the medicine was working. No further questions. There's something deeply Tudor about that logic, a mixture of denial and discipline, all cloaked in ritual. Henry wasn't trying to numb emotional pain, at least not explicitly. He was trying to preserve power, and power, in his case, meant keeping a rotting leg hidden under layers of velvet, and a mind alert enough to navigate the treacheries of court intrigue. If the drugs helped with that, then so be it. His doctors would have nodded solemnly. His courtiers would have looked the other way. Pain, after all, was unseemly in a monarch. And Henry, despite his rages and failures, never wanted to appear weak. His later years were marked by physical decline and paranoia, but not by collapse. The medicine worked, enough to keep him upright, speaking, judging, enough to sign orders and annul marriages, enough to remind everyone that the king was still the king. What it didn't do was heal him. But healing, as it turns out, wasn't the goal. Not for Henry, and not for many monarchs who came after. The goal was performance. And opiates, whether in the form of Tudor powders or Victorian tinctures, were the backstage pass to keep the show going. A few centuries later, a very different king, more restrained, more modern, but no less embedded in royal ceremony, would also receive opiates near the end of his life. This time, not for preservation, but for an exit. And the dose wasn't just medicinal, it was final. His name was Edward VII. 11. Edward VII. To understand Edward VII is to understand the art of delay. He waited longer than any heir in British history to inherit the throne. Nearly 60 years in waiting, a lifetime in the shadow of his famously dour mother, Queen Victoria. By the time he finally ascended in 1901, he was already old, round, and tired. But he made up for it in style. Edward brought color to a court that had lived too long in black. He partied, traveled, modernized diplomacy, and wore fashion like armor. What he didn't escape, however, was pain, the physical kind that clings to kings and the medical kind that comes dressed as progress. Edward reigned for only 9 years, but they were eventful. Politically, he was savvy, a monarch who could charm the French while irritating his own ministers. Personally, he was indulgent, fond of food, drink, and the kind of leisure that required many waistcoats. And behind the scenes, he was the recipient of a quietly changing medical world. One where the drugs got stronger, the explanations got longer, and the consequences more invisible. By the early 1900s, morphine and cocaine had become not just accepted, but fashionable in elite medicine. No longer the mysterious tinctures of Victorian apothecaries, these substances were now seen as tools of surgical sophistication and clinical precision. Dentists used cocaine as a local anesthetic. Surgeons used morphine to manage post-operative pain. And royals, predictably, had access to the best and worst of both. Edward VII's personal medical records, like most royal files, are selectively public. But we know enough from diaries, physician memoirs, and court accounts to piece together the picture. He suffered from bronchitis, rheumatism, and arteriosclerosis, the trifecta of an aging, sedentary monarch. As his health declined, so did his tolerance for discomfort. His physicians, caught between their duty to soothe and their fear of overstepping, leaned increasingly on the drugs that had quietly become the backbone of royal medicine: opiates and anesthetics. Morphine was used not as a dramatic intervention, but as a routine measure, administered in low doses for pain, for sleep, for coughing fits that wouldn't stop. Cocaine, meanwhile, made its appearances in surgical procedures and dental work, delivered in clinical settings with a professionalism that masked its risks. In Edward's world, these drugs weren't taboo. They were tools, civilized, modern, and, in the right amounts, respectable. But here's where the line starts to blur. These substances were dangerously effective. They masked the warning signs of deeper issues. A monarch who could be made comfortable was a monarch who could keep functioning. And as with his predecessors, the priority was never full recovery. It was functionality, appearances, the illusion of strength. Edward died in 1910 after a series of heart attacks. Officially, his passing was described as peaceful, but Peaceful is often a euphemism, especially in royal contexts. It likely involved morphine, perhaps other sedatives, delivered under the calm supervision of palace doctors, trained more in discretion than disclosure. What mattered was that the king was not seen to suffer. And in that sense, the medicine did its job. His death was also symbolic. It marked the end of the Edwardian era, a period of glittering artifice, royal charm, and rapidly advancing science. But it also cemented a deeper truth, that royal bodies, no matter how exalted, were still just bodies. They ached, they failed, and when they did, the response was chemical silence, not confrontation. The stage had been set for the 20th century, an age where drugs would no longer be cloaked in poetry or myth, but administered with clinical regularity. And for one of Edward's sons, this would mean far more than symptom management. Because at the end of his life, George V wasn't just given morphine for comfort, he was given enough to stop his heart. Along with a second drug, even stronger. The reason? Not medical, not exactly. It was timing. 12. George V. If the British monarchy had a patron saint of understatement, it would have been George V. Stiff, dutiful, and deeply allergic to drama. He was a man who spent his entire reign trying to keep things calm. And perhaps, in the end, that's exactly what he got. Calmness, medically induced, final, and eerily well-timed. George V came to the throne in 1910 after the death of his father, Edward VII, and inherited not only the empire, but also a world on the edge of modernity. Airplanes, telephones, and revolutions were rewriting what royal meant. He wasn't a flamboyant figure like his father, nor a visionary like his grandmother Victoria. He was a man of discipline and dullness, which, in the chaos of the early 20th century, turned out to be an asset. His image was that of stability incarnate, the dependable king who guided Britain through the First World War and into the brittle calm of the interwar years. But behind that image, as always, there was pain, and the same quiet reliance on chemical control that had followed the royal line for centuries. George suffered from chronic respiratory illness, likely exacerbated by a lifetime of heavy smoking and the damp British climate. His lungs were perpetually weak, his circulation poor. He caught colds easily and recovered slowly. In the final decade of his life, he developed chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, though it wasn't called that at the time. The palace called it bronchial trouble, a phrase that sounded polite enough for newspapers but vague enough to hide the truth. The king was struggling to breathe. Doctors of the period, trained in a strange blend of Edwardian gentility and modern pharmacology, reached for what they knew worked: morphine for pain, cocaine for alertness, digitalis for the heart. None of it was unusual. The same cocktail was being administered in hospitals across Britain. But this was no hospital ward. This was Buckingham Palace, where medicine met monarchy, and discretion was as much a prescription as any drug. By January 1936, George was fading fast. The last photographs show a man barely holding himself upright, his eyes dulled by exhaustion. His personal physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, was summoned to Sandringham to oversee the final days. Dawson, a man of impeccable credentials and even more impeccable confidence, made sure the royal decline unfolded according to plan. Or rather, his plan. On the night of January 20th, as George V's breathing grew shallow and his pulse slowed, Dawson administered a combination of morphine and cocaine directly into the king's veins. The official line was that it was to relieve pain. But later, Dawson admitted, in his own diary no less, that the dose had been intentionally lethal. He wrote with the dry precision of a man justifying logistics that the injection was given to preserve the king's dignity and to assure that his death might be announced in the morning papers rather than the less appropriate evening journals. It was, in essence, a scheduled death. The quantity administered would have been far beyond any therapeutic amount. Morphine to depress respiration, cocaine to stimulate the heart briefly, a pharmacological paradox designed not to save, but to time. And so, at precisely 11:55 p.m., George V died. Peacefully, as the press would say. Mercifully, as his doctors would claim. Conveniently, as history would later observe. The revelation of Dawson's Act, which came to light years later, sparked outrage and fascination in equal measure. Was it mercy? Murder? A physician's hubris dressed as compassion? Perhaps all three. What's certain is that it cemented an extraordinary irony. The king who had built his reign on stability left the world in the most meticulously managed way possible. Euthanized not by scandal or illness, but by the clinical choreography of a doctor's conscience. Yet, for all the controversy, the episode fit perfectly into the royal medical pattern. The palace had long mastered the art of controlling both pain and narrative. Drugs, whether laudanum, chloroform, or morphine, had always been instruments of image as much as medicine. The royal body was not permitted to writhe, gasp, or suffer publicly. Dignity in this context meant silence. And silence was something opiates could always provide. After George's death, the monarchy moved forward with its usual pragmatism. His son, Edward VIII, ascended briefly and abdicated spectacularly. His other son, George VI, took on the burden of duty with trembling hands and a stammering voice. But it wasn't just the crown that passed from father to son. It was the unspoken understanding that royal frailty must always be managed chemically. The show, after all, could never stop. And the use of dangerous drugs in royal life was not limited to dying kings. It was woven into the medical routines of their queens. Women who endured the same illnesses, the same expectations of grace, and the same doctors armed with tinctures and tonics. One of them, centuries before, had fought her own war with laudanum during a smallpox epidemic. Her name was Mary II. 13. Mary II. History doesn't talk much about Mary II, not in the way it talks about her husband, William III, or her father, James II, or even the revolution she helped legitimize. That's partly because she died young, at the age of 32, and partly because she was, by many accounts, too obedient to be thrilling and too earnest to be legendary. But Mary was more than a political placeholder. She was a queen who ruled jointly, loved devoutly, and suffered quietly, especially in her final weeks, when the courtiers whispered about her illness and the physicians did what they always did when the royal body faltered. They reached for laudanum. It was December of 1694 when Mary fell ill. The official diagnosis was smallpox, the dreaded, disfiguring disease that had haunted European courts for centuries. There were no vaccines, no antivirals, and very little hope. Treatments at the time were a volatile mixture of superstition and what passed for emerging science. Physicians believed in balancing humors, purging toxins, and, crucially, dulling pain wherever possible. For that, they turned to opium. Laudanum was not new to the late 17th century. It had been used for decades by then, a staple of both folk remedies and elite medicine. But for someone like Mary, it was prepared with special precision. Suspended in alcohol, flavored with herbs, and administered in increasingly frequent doses, laudanum became the unofficial language of royal suffering. A liquid veil between agony and composure. Mary's case was severe. The smallpox advanced rapidly, robbing her of strength, then clarity. According to accounts from the time, she endured days of high fever, pain, and delirium. Her doctors, powerless to halt the disease itself, could at least offer sedation. Whether it was to ease her discomfort or preserve royal decorum, or both, the record suggests she was given laudanum regularly in her final days. No one called it addiction. That concept, as we understand it, simply didn't exist in her world. Repeated dosing wasn't seen as dependency. It was seen as good care. If the queen needed more of the same substance to rest, to stay calm, to ease the terrible progression of the illness, That was medicine doing its work. And when she eventually slipped into unconsciousness, there was no scandal, only solemnity. The queen was dying as she had lived, devout, controlled, and attended by men who swore they had done everything possible. Yet underneath the rituals, there was something hauntingly modern in Mary's story. Here was a woman whose final days were chemically cushioned, not in the excessive or conspiratorial sense that later royals would experience, but in the quiet, sanctioned way that palaces preferred. The drug, though dangerous, was not feared. It was respected. Respected enough to be used liberally. Respected enough to become invisible. William, her husband and co-sovereign, was devastated. He reportedly said he felt broken to pieces after her death, one of the rare moments in which his famously guarded emotional life seemed to falter. But even his grief was subsumed by the machinery of state. The queen was buried, the line of succession preserved, and the laudanum bottles quietly restocked for the next inevitable case. Mary's use of opium was part of a much larger pattern, one that didn't begin or end with her. The idea that royal pain should be soothed, not witnessed, was already centuries old. And laudanum, with its elegant name and brutal efficiency, fit perfectly into that philosophy. It allowed monarchs to die with dignity and live in denial, both equally useful in a system built on performance. But Mary's death wasn't the end of Stuart reliance on medical sedation. Her husband, William III, would soon face his own physical decline, and with it the same cast of doctors and the same trusted prescription. He didn't suffer from smallpox, but from chronic pain and injuries that refused to heal. And what they gave him, predictably, was the one thing that made even royal agony tolerable: 14. William III. If Mary II was the pious and tragic half of the throne, William III was the soldier. Stoic, asthmatic, and never quite at ease in England, he ruled with a sense of grim purpose more than joy. He hadn't come to the throne by birthright alone, but by invitation, a revolution in velvet gloves. And though he helped solidify constitutional monarchy and survived countless assassination plots, there was one adversary he never managed to outmaneuver: chronic, unrelenting pain. William's body was, from early adulthood, an uneasy vessel. He suffered from asthma, persistent sinus infections, inflammatory conditions, and later in life, injuries from a series of riding accidents, including one fall that likely hastened his death. His health was a quiet crisis, managed day to day by physicians who, as was customary in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, relied heavily on sedatives, tonics, and opiate-based concoctions. What made William's case different wasn't the medicine itself. Laudanum, opiate syrups, and calming tinctures were already standard in royal households. It was how quietly and consistently they were used to keep him functional. William didn't seek sympathy. He sought control. And when his body failed to cooperate, he, or more precisely his doctors, turned to chemistry to maintain the illusion of command. Laudanum was the default. Dissolved opium in a tincture of alcohol, often dosed conservatively at first, then more liberally as tolerance built. It was prescribed for everything: sleeplessness, coughing, aching joints, melancholia, nervous unrest. In William's case, it would have served as both an anesthetic and a stabilizer, masking his ailments without necessarily treating them. That wasn't the goal. The goal was governance without interruption. By the time he reached his 50s, William was physically diminished. He had always been thin, but now he looked gaunt. He developed a chronic cough. He rode less often. And then came the accident. In 1702, his horse stumbled on a molehill while he was out riding in Hampton Court Park. The fall shattered his collarbone. At first, the injury seemed manageable. He was expected to recover, but complications arose. The fracture didn't heal cleanly. Infection likely set in, and his already weakened body began to deteriorate. During his convalescence, William was treated, again, with the only drugs his doctors truly trusted: opiates to dull the pain, and wine to carry the dose. We don't have precise dosage logs, but the pattern is unmistakable. The king became increasingly sedated. Visitors noticed his weariness. He held fewer councils. And when he did appear in public, his speech was slower, his movements more labored. The medications that had once helped him function were now likely assisting in his quiet retreat from life. His death came shortly after, in March of 1702. Officially, the cause was complications from pneumonia, but it's likely that a combination of infection, immobility, and general systemic decline played a role. Laudanum, always discreet, may have made the last stretch more bearable, or at least more manageable for those around him. William's end, like Mary's before him, was shaped by a belief that royal suffering must never become royal spectacle. The monarchy had to endure, even if the body didn't, and if drugs helped, so be it. Laudanum wasn't scandalous, it was protocol. A medical tool, yes, but also a social lubricant, a curtain drawn politely over decline. The irony is that William had spent his reign trying to bring order to England, to secure a Protestant succession, to limit absolutism, to modernize the state. But his own final chapter was a page from the oldest book in monarchy, Pain Managed Behind Closed Doors, by tinctures no one questioned. And yet, as the next generation of royals stepped forward, the drugs didn't go away. If anything, they became more accessible, more potent, and more socially acceptable. Georgian queens and consorts inherited not just titles, but a medical culture where opiates were as routine as tea. One such queen, clever, politically savvy, and quietly enduring, would become emblematic of the Georgian royal medical playbook. Her name was Caroline of Ansbach. Her prescription? Laudanum. Again, 15. Queen Caroline of Ansbach. Caroline of Ansbach wasn't a passive consort. She wasn't there to simply smile and nod while the king made decisions. She debated bishops, advised ministers, and occasionally outmaneuvered both. As the wife of George II and the unofficial brains of the Georgian monarchy, Queen Caroline operated like a stateswoman in a corset, well-read, politically fluent, and quietly commanding behind the throne. But even the sharpest minds are tethered to flesh, and Caroline's body, like so many queens before her, was a battlefield of expectation, illness, and chemical appeasement. Born into a world where royal women were expected to be both ornamental and endlessly fertile, Caroline managed to be both, and more. She bore 8 children, survived the intense scrutiny of court life, and navigated the volatile politics of Hanoverian England with remarkable grace. But beneath the layers of silk and diplomacy was a woman in pain, pain that arrived with pregnancies, with surgeries, with age, and like many before her, she turned to the medicine of the time, opium, or, more precisely, laudanum. The early Georgian period marked a strange pivot in medical history. Enlightenment thinking had started to question superstition, but clinical practice was still heavily reliant on remedies inherited from the centuries before. Laudanum, now a familiar presence in court medicine, was administered for nearly everything: nervous disorders, gastrointestinal issues, cramps, migraines, insomnia. It was particularly prized for women's ailments, which, not coincidentally, included everything from real gynecological conditions to the vague yet omnipresent diagnosis of hysteria. For a queen like Caroline, the calculus was simple: be presentable, be composed, be productive. The court had no patience for chronic discomfort and no vocabulary for the emotional toll of constant childbearing. Laudanum softened the sharp edges of those expectations. And while the historical record is tactful, no detailed prescriptions, no dramatic anecdotes, the use of opiates in Caroline's medical care is well documented through the common practices of her time. Her physicians, trained in both Hanover and England, routinely employed tinctures that featured opium as their main ingredient. The dosage, of course, was administered with courtly discretion. Caroline's final years were marked by increasing physical decline. She suffered from what was then referred to as an umbilical rupture, a hernia made worse by multiple pregnancies and likely compounded by limited medical interventions. Over time, it became strangulated, causing intense abdominal pain and systemic infection. Surgery was attempted, a brutal, early modern ordeal performed without the benefit of anesthesia as we understand it today. She reportedly endured the procedure with the stoic calm expected of her, but one can assume that liberal quantities of laudanum were used before, during, and after. The substance didn't cure, but it comforted. Or, more accurately, it allowed the royal body to continue playing its role. She died in 1737 after a slow, agonizing decline, refusing to let her children see the worst of her suffering. Her dignity, she believed, was a duty. George II, famously gruff and often aloof, was reportedly devastated. He never remarried and ordered that he be buried beside her, with a removable panel in the coffin wall between them so their remains could mingle. It's a romantic image, but beneath it is the quieter, bleaker truth of her final months. A woman, once powerful and decisive, reduced to managing unbearable pain with the only option her era afforded: a bottle. Caroline's story is a textbook case of royal resilience propped up by pharmacology. She didn't indulge, she endured. And in doing so, she set a template for many royal women who followed. Queens and princesses whose lives were punctuated by ceremonial appearances and private suffering, and whose ailments were quietly blurred by doses prescribed not just by doctors, but by tradition. And so it continued. Because Caroline's husband, George II, would follow a similar path. As age crept in and the ailments multiplied, the palace doctors opened the same drawers, prepared the same tinctures, and relied, once again, on the comforting fog of opium. 16. George II. George II was a man often remembered for his temper, his punctuality, and his complete lack of romanticism. He wasn't the kind of monarch who inspired epic ballads or sweeping court gossip. He was methodical, emotionally reserved, and, above all else, consistent. He rose early. He attended to his paperwork. He fought his wars. He disliked change. But like most men who try to outrun their own bodies, he eventually found himself in a slow-motion chase with pain, illness, and the medical habits of his age. And the weapon of choice, or habit rather, was once again opium, dressed in its usual disguise, laudanum. To the outside world, George II aged predictably. He grew more stooped, more irritable, and more entrenched in his routines. What changed, almost invisibly, was how those routines were sustained. Like his wife, Caroline of Ansbach, he lived in a court deeply reliant on medicinal traditions imported from both the Enlightenment and its medieval past. That meant one thing above all: tinctures. Bottled mixtures that promised to soothe, regulate, and dignify the crumbling machinery of the royal body. George II's medical files are sparse, in part because he was deeply private, and in part because 18th century medical reporting was more anecdotal than systematic. But we know enough to reconstruct the pattern. His ailments in later life included chronic indigestion, joint pain, episodes of faintness, and declining sleep quality, all typical for someone of his age and lifestyle. His doctors responded not with invasive procedures, but with what they considered more humane, gentlemanly measures: tonics, bloodletting, and of course, opiates. Laudanum, by this point in history, was practically royal shorthand for "do not disturb." It was the standard prescription for insomnia, minor pain, anxiety, irregular bowels, and any symptom that defied easy categorization. It came pre-approved by the court, the culture, and generations of medical precedent. George, pragmatic to the end, had no reason to object. He trusted his physicians. A cadre of loyal professionals who knew that the true art of royal medicine was not curing, but maintaining. He didn't advertise his dosing. But then, no monarch did. Drug use in the Georgian court was not a scandal. It was etiquette. The ideal king did not grimace or fidget or groan. He did not lose his temper because of a migraine. He did not cancel council meetings because of restless nights. He did his duty. And if that required a teaspoon of tincture in the morning and another before bed, then so be it. George's use of laudanum, if not constant, then certainly consistent, followed the same path as those before him. The slow elevation of dosage over time, the blurring of discomfort, the masking of symptoms. It worked until it didn't. On the morning of October 25, 1760, at the age of 76, he rose early as usual, complained of some discomfort, and died suddenly. Either from an aortic aneurysm or a heart attack. The records are vague, but the real cause might as well have been inevitability. The body gave out. The medicine was simply along for the ride. There was no great scandal, no controversy, no whispered rumors. Just another royal death, managed with the same quiet tools that had served the monarchy for generations. Laudanum hadn't killed him, but it had shaped how he aged, how he endured, and how he was remembered, as a monarch who remained calm even when his body tried not to be. And as ever, the story didn't end there. George VI's royal household was full of heirs, wives, and children, each raised in a palace where bottles of opium tincture were as familiar as portraits on the wall. One of them, Princess Augusta, would carry the same medical legacy forward. She was a daughter-in-law, a mother of kings, and a woman routinely dosed into silence. 17. Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. History rarely makes room for Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha to speak. She arrived in Britain in 1736 at the age of 17. A German princess, unfamiliar with English customs, court politics, or the rigid expectations that would soon define her life. Married off to Frederick, Prince of Wales, she entered the royal family not as a partner, but as an instrument of dynastic planning. She bore the pressure with royal composure and, eventually, laudanum. Her life was marked early by isolation. Augusta's husband, Frederick, was famously estranged from his own father, George II, a feud that reached such cartoonish proportions that Frederick wasn't even allowed inside St. James's Palace when his wife went into labor. Augusta was forced to give birth in secret, in the dead of night, far from the prying eyes of the king, who suspected, with no real evidence, that his son and daughter-in-law were trying to conceal the identity of their child. That child, by the way, would become George III. Frederick's death in 1751, at the age of 44, left Augusta a widow at just 32. From that point on, she retreated behind the heavy velvet of court protocol. She dressed in mourning and rarely re-emerged from it. Her new role was that of dowager princess and royal guardian, charged with overseeing the education and moral development of her children, particularly her eldest son, the future king. But hers was not a peaceful widowhood. It was crowded with responsibilities, loneliness, political tension, and, increasingly, health problems. She suffered from what court physicians of the time called nervous complaints, a vague category that encompassed everything from anxiety and melancholy to digestive disorders, sleep disturbances, and menstrual irregularities. Today, we'd recognize much of it as chronic stress compounded by grief, medical neglect, and emotional suppression. But in 18th century Britain, the solution was simple and liquid: laudanum. Prescribed by court physicians for both physical and emotional ailments, laudanum became a standard part of Augusta's medical routine. The practice was entirely in line with the period, especially for noblewomen, whose pain was rarely taken seriously unless it could be quietly medicated. Laudanum dulled the nerves. It encouraged sleep. It soothed the stomach. And perhaps most importantly, it kept the patient from disrupting the order of things. For Augusta, whose life had become a long exercise in containment, the drug offered something dangerously close to comfort. It is unlikely that Augusta was ever diagnosed with an addiction. The very concept didn't exist in the form we recognize today, and certainly not in the rarefied air of the British monarchy. She was simply unwell, and therefore treated. If her dosages increased, that was seen as part of her condition, not a symptom of chemical dependence, but of her body's fragility. Her letters from this period become increasingly sparse, her public appearances rare. The quiet that surrounded her was both literal and pharmaceutical. And yet, she remained politically influential. Even while veiled in black and numbed by tinctures, Augusta maneuvered to protect her son from the influence of rival factions at court. She shielded him from the king's circle, advised his tutors, and played a central role in his political formation. In many ways, the future George III was shaped as much by her maternal strategy as by any policy pamphlet or royal advisor. She was present, persistent, and very likely sedated. When she died in 1772, at the age of 52, the public response was minimal. Augusta had never been a popular figure, but her quiet life left an enduring legacy, a generation of royals raised in a household where emotional discomfort was treated, not discussed, where the royal body was soothed into compliance, and where laudanum was as normal as tea. And her daughter, Princess Mary, a woman born into that same royal system of subtle suffering, would follow the pattern precisely. She would live long, smile softly, and medicate quietly. Because by the 19th century, laudanum wasn't just a treatment, it was a tradition. 18. Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester and Edinburgh. By the time Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester and Edinburgh reached old age, she had outlived nearly everyone who once remembered her youth. Born in 1776, the 11th child of King George III and Queen Charlotte, Mary came into the world during a time of revolution, both across the Atlantic and within the walls of her own palace. Her father's periodic mental illness would define much of her early life, and her own legacy would be defined not by scandal or spectacle, but by quiet endurance. That and laudanum, always laudanum. Mary lived a remarkably long life for a Georgian royal, dying in 1857 at the age of 81. In doing so, she became the last surviving child of George III, a bridge between centuries, between dynasties, and between two radically different eras of British medicine. She was born in an age where opiates were prescribed by gentlemen doctors with quills and corked bottles, and she died in an age of chloroform, railway expansion, and Queen Victoria. Through all of it, she remained in the background, dutiful, reserved, and deeply embedded in the culture of silent suffering. Her life was marked by quiet expectations and constant proximity to loss. She was the sister of two kings, George IV and William IV, and the aunt of another, Queen Victoria. She grew up surrounded by the public chaos of her father's illness and the private tragedy of her mother's stoic emotional restraint. Court life was structured, ceremonial, and often emotionally vacant. Like many royal women of her era, Mary learned that physical discomfort, nervous exhaustion, and emotional fatigue were to be treated, not expressed. And treatment, of course, meant tinctures. Though she was not known for causing headlines, the medical records and cultural context surrounding Mary suggest a long-term exposure to opiates, most commonly in the form of laudanum. Throughout the late Georgian and early Victorian periods, laudanum remained the gold standard for managing the invisible afflictions of aristocratic women. Insomnia, migraines, digestive problems, melancholy, anxiety. Physicians, particularly those in royal households, rarely questioned the long-term use of such remedies. In fact, they expected it. Mary's later life was marked by a gradual withdrawal from public duties and increased frailty, a word that recurs frequently in letters and biographies of the time. Delicate health, her contemporaries called it. A phrase so broad and so conveniently vague it might mean anything, but almost certainly included what we now recognize as a dependence on sedatives. Her household staff and physicians would have ensured her constant access to laudanum, not as an indulgence, but as a necessity. At a time when there were no antidepressants, no anti-inflammatories, and no legal distinction between pain relief and sedation, laudanum was a kind of all-purpose solution. It took the edge off of chronic pain. It helped one sleep. And perhaps most importantly, it kept royal women like Mary quietly functional, not demanding, not distressed, not disruptive. Mary's existence was never dramatic, but it was deeply revealing. She inhabited the royal system from within, never challenging its expectations, but absorbing them completely. She was a portrait of compliance, gracious, forgettable, enduring. And yet, behind that portrait was a body slowly calibrated to opium. Not abused, not scandalized, just accustomed. Which, in many ways, is the more unsettling scenario. Not addiction in crisis mode, but addiction in routine. She died peacefully, they said. The kind of peace that comes after years of managed silence. But the lineage of medicated royalty didn't end with her. Because Mary's life overlapped with another, a consort who faced even greater pressure to bear children and carry the weight of national hopes. A woman whose own miscarriages, illnesses, and chronic grief would be treated not with therapy or conversation, but with the exact same tinctures poured from the exact same bottles. Her name was Adelaide. Her fate was to suffer quietly and be dosed accordingly. 19. Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen was never meant to be queen. She married Prince William, Duke of Clarence, in 1818, when he was already 52 years old, childless, and considered unlikely to ever take the throne. But fate, or more precisely, the death of several closer heirs, would shift the course of her life. When William became king. William IV in 1830, Adelaide found herself reluctantly elevated to queen consort. But for a woman raised on duty and Lutheran modesty, the crown was not a symbol of glory. It was a weight, one that became heavier with every miscarriage, every lost child, and every quiet dose of laudanum. Adelaide was described in her time as virtuous, gentle, and uncomplaining, the very image of Victorian queenliness, even before Victoria herself arrived. She was pious but not severe, loyal without being political, and unfailingly polite. But beneath the soft public portrait was a woman whose body was battered by repeated pregnancies and the medical consequences of early 19th century obstetrics. Between 1819 and 1822, Adelaide experienced 2 miscarriages, a stillbirth, and the death of a newborn daughter. These tragedies came in rapid succession and left her physically weakened and emotionally hollowed out. Of course, such grief was not publicly discussed, not in a palace, and certainly not by a queen. The public was informed of births and deaths, but not of suffering. That, as always, was handled internally, both emotionally and chemically. Court doctors, trained in the protocols of both Hanoverian and British medicine, did what they had always done for royal women facing loss and chronic pain. They reached for the opiates. Laudanum was the drug of choice. By Adelaide's time, it was already entrenched in elite medical care. While not as openly marketed as it would later be in Victorian England, it was still common in every royal apothecary. Her physicians would have prescribed it for a range of conditions, to soothe the pain of miscarriage, to help her sleep, to ease the nerves that inevitably came with compounded grief and physical trauma. The doses were measured, recorded, and repeated. No one questioned the wisdom of it. Pain required silence, and laudanum was the quickest route. The effects of this regimen are not spectacular. There were no dramatic collapses, no royal scandals. But what emerges from the historical record is something more insidious, the slow dulling of vitality. Adelaide's public life shrank as her health declined. By the time William ascended the throne, she was already known for her delicate constitution. And as queen, she performed her role dutifully but minimally, appearing at ceremonies, issuing charitable donations, and otherwise fading into the background of court life. Privately, she remained deeply religious and inclined to solitude. Her letters, where they survive, reveal a woman more stoic than spirited, someone who accepted sorrow as a kind of divine assignment. But one can't help noticing the gaps. The missing days, the unexplained absences, the subtle hints in third-party accounts that Her Majesty was not well. And always the undertone, the physicians were managing it, quietly, respectfully, chemically. After King William IV's death in 1837, Adelaide withdrew almost entirely from public life. She lived out her widowhood in a state of measured obscurity, remembered primarily for her gentleness and charity. But the tragedy is how little was ever asked of her except to endure. Endure the losses, endure the pain, endure the expectations, and take what the doctors gave her. She died in 1849 at the age of 57. The city of Adelaide in Australia bears her name, a bright and sunny tribute to a woman whose life was anything but. Her legacy was shaped by absence, of heirs, of health, of noise. And yet, she was not alone in this quiet pattern. Another royal woman, younger, more outspoken, but caught in the same system, would follow closely behind. Her name was Princess Louise, and while the public knew her as the rebellious daughter of Queen Victoria, behind the scenes, she too was quietly managed with the era's favorite drug, 20. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Among Queen Victoria's many children, Princess Louise was the anomaly. Artistically inclined, politically curious, and far less interested in ceremonial routine than her siblings, she cut a striking figure. Not just because she was beautiful, though that was often said, but because she was uncommonly resistant to the box she was meant to live in. While her sisters followed the expected path of quiet marriages and quieter motherhood, Louise rebelled in the only ways a Victorian princess could, through sculpting, outspoken opinions, and a personal life that refused to sit still. But rebellion, even of the most restrained variety, came at a cost. And like so many royal women before her, that cost was managed with a bottle. Laudanum again. Of course. Princess Louise was born in 1848, the sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Her early life was shaped by two dominant forces: her mother's intense mourning following Albert's death in 1861, and the ironclad rules of Victorian domestic life. While the court grew increasingly somber and ritualized, Louise became restive. She wanted more education, more freedom, more than just the role of ornamental daughter to an increasingly withdrawn queen. She found some of it. She studied art seriously, even attending the National Art Training School, a rare concession for a royal woman, and became an accomplished sculptor. Her work was exhibited publicly, and she received commissions for memorials and portraits. But alongside her public progress came persistent whispers of physical ailments and what were politely called nervous issues. The diagnosis didn't matter much. The treatment was already decided. Louise's reliance on laudanum is not thoroughly documented in prescription books, but it doesn't need to be. The cultural and medical context fills in the gaps. Victorian medicine had created a model for handling women like her, intelligent, independent, emotionally complex. The solution was to reduce the volume, to take the edge off, to restore balance. Laudanum was the go-to. Victorian-era biographies and letters mention frequent headaches, migraines, bouts of fatigue, and unspecified attacks. All of these were common euphemisms for conditions treated with opiates. And though Louise was more public than many royal women of her time, she was still subject to the same expectations. Don't disrupt the narrative. If you suffer, suffer quietly. And if you can't, be sedated. There were other factors. Her marriage to John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll, was strained almost from the beginning. It was a union based more on political convenience than emotional connection. The two often lived apart, and speculation about their unhappiness and his rumored sexuality only grew with time. Louise, outwardly composed, reportedly took to long periods of retreat. Artist studios, country houses, and, in all likelihood, the same cabinet of calming tinctures that graced the shelves of every well-appointed Victorian home. The great irony is that she was, in so many ways, ahead of her time. She supported women's education. She moved through the art world with some degree of autonomy. She pushed back against her mother's suffocating control. But even Louise, with her privileges and talents, was ultimately managed by the medical orthodoxy of the day. A system that viewed her not as a full human being, but as a restless patient. One to be soothed, not heard. By her later years, she had retreated almost completely from public life. Her health had deteriorated, the specifics remained vague, and her appearances became infrequent. She died in 1939 at the age of 91, after witnessing the twilight of the empire she was born into. She outlived her siblings, her scandals, and even the era of laudanum itself. But her life was shaped by it all the same. She wasn't the only one. Her younger sister, Princess Beatrice, the loyal daughter, the family archivist, the ever-watchful presence at Queen Victoria's side, would also find herself entangled in the quiet, medicinal habits of the court. For Beatrice, the duty was different, but the treatment was the same. 21. Princess Beatrice. Princess Beatrice, the youngest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, was born into mourning. Her father died when she was only 4 years old, and her mother, inconsolable, never truly recovered. From that point forward, Beatrice's role in the royal household was set, not as a future queen or even an independent duchess, but as a living memorial. She would be the daughter who stayed, the daughter who listened, the daughter who didn't leave. And in return, she inherited not just a position at her mother's side, but the royal household's most enduring inheritance, chronic emotional restraint, and a medicine cabinet full of laudanum. From childhood, Beatrice was trained in silence, the kind you wear like lace. She was quiet, obedient, and affectionate, and these traits quickly became duties. Victoria, increasingly withdrawn after Prince Albert's death, came to rely on Beatrice not just for companionship, but for emotional containment. Beatrice read aloud to her mother, transcribed her letters, and remained at her side even as her older siblings married and moved away. It was a life built on proximity, not autonomy. By the time she reached her 20s, Beatrice had become more of a caretaker than a princess. When she fell in love with Prince Henry of Battenberg, Queen Victoria's reaction was predictably complex, a mixture of maternal possessiveness and imperial politics. The marriage was only permitted on the condition that Beatrice and her husband would live with the Queen, an arrangement that turned marital life into a kind of royal annex. Beatrice agreed. She always agreed. But agreement in her case didn't mean peace. Throughout her adult life, Beatrice was plagued by what Victorian physicians referred to as nerves, low spirits, and weakness. These umbrella terms covered a range of physical and emotional symptoms, from insomnia and migraines to fatigue and what we might now understand as depression. The royal solution was as familiar as it was inevitable: opiates. In Beatrice's day, laudanum and similar compounds were still considered standard treatments for women's ailments, especially when those ailments were ambiguous enough to defy easier classification. Her private life gave her plenty of reasons to hurt. Prince Henry died unexpectedly in 1896 while serving in the Ashanti War, leaving Beatrice widowed with 4 young children. The grief was profound, but characteristically muted. She resumed her public duties and continued her role as Queen Victoria's constant companion. If there were outbursts of sorrow or anger, history does not record them. What it does suggest is that Beatrice, like so many royal women before her, was quietly medicated through her mourning. The late Victorian household, despite its moral sternness, was awash in pharmaceuticals. Sedatives, tonics, and narcotic tinctures were part of the daily rhythm, administered with formality and assurance. Beatrice's use of these substances was not exceptional. It was expected. They were tools to keep grief manageable, to keep public appearances possible, to keep the weight of her obligations from cracking the surface. After her mother's death in 1901, Beatrice assumed the monumental task of editing Queen Victoria's journals, a project that would take her decades and become her life's defining work. It was meticulous, exhausting, and emotionally draining. Thousands of pages, years of memory. A daughter's last service to a mother who had never let her go. The task became her identity. And while there is no clinical record of her medical routine during those years, it's easy to see how the strain, physical and emotional, would have demanded assistance. Laudanum use persisted into the early 20th century in Britain's upper classes, though it was gradually replaced by barbiturates and other sedatives. Beatrice lived through that transition, surviving until 1944, one of the last living links to the Victorian world. Her final years were spent in quiet retreat, surrounded by memories and history, but largely removed from public life. She remained the image of grace. She always had. But her life was a case study in how emotional labor, royal duty, and silent suffering were anesthetized, not acknowledged. And she wasn't the last, because just a few decades later, her niece, another Princess Mary, living through a new century with the same old expectations, would find herself treated by the same fading medical playbook. Only the names of the drugs had changed. The logic stayed exactly the same. 22. Princess Mary, Princess Royal, and Countess of Harewood. Princess Mary was born in 1897, just before the Victorian world began to fade into sepia. She was the only daughter of King George V and Queen Mary, a royal by blood, title, and temperament, reserved, resilient, and relentlessly dutiful. While her brothers shouldered the weight of monarchy and war, Mary took on the quieter burdens, morale visits, charity drives, and smiling diplomacy. She embodied the ideal royal woman of her age, composed, patriotic, uncomplaining. And like so many who mastered the art of composure, she did it under the influence of medicine that blurred the sharp edges of her reality. By the time Mary entered adulthood, the medical tide had begun to shift. The ornate apothecaries of the 19th century were being replaced by white-coated science. Laudanum was falling out of favor, its dangers more openly acknowledged. But in its place came morphine, not in Victorian droppers and teaspoons, but in clean glass syringes, prescribed and administered with clinical confidence. The chemistry had changed, but the purpose remained the same. Keep the royal body quiet. Keep the royal mind steady. Keep the royal face calm. Mary was expected to be many things, but expressive was not one of them. Her life was shaped by a wartime adolescence and the stifling expectations of her royal household. During World War I, she launched the now famous Princess Mary Christmas Gift Fund, sending small care packages to soldiers on the front. It was noble, yes, and widely praised. But behind that act of compassion was a young woman who had never truly been allowed to grieve, to panic, or to protest. She was, like the cigarettes and chocolates in those care boxes, a balm. Reassurance in human form. Marriage came in 1922 to Henry Lascelles, 6th Earl of Harewood, a man twice her age, aristocratic and appropriate. Their union was arranged in the way all royal marriages were at the time, gently coerced by duty and sealed with public approval. Mary, reportedly reluctant, complied. She had been trained for compliance, and while the marriage was outwardly functional, her health began to show signs of strain. Throughout her adult life, Mary experienced recurring bouts of exhaustion, minor cardiac complaints, and periods of what doctors then called neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis for anyone suffering from the consequences of relentless expectation. The treatment was, predictably, chemical. Morphine was commonly used by royal physicians during this period, particularly for conditions related to fatigue, pain, and anxiety. While direct documentation of Mary's prescriptions is limited, palace medicine always preferred discretion. The surrounding context makes her exposure almost certain. This wasn't addiction as scandal, it was routine. The morphine was given after surgeries, during long illnesses, or simply as a sleep aid during royal tours. It was part of the background noise of upper-class healthcare, a quiet drip of pharmacological assistance that made life at court survivable. Mary aged into a figure of stoic elegance, eventually taking on the title of Princess Royal in 1932. She performed her duties without complaint, visiting hospitals, opening exhibitions, and representing the crown with a quiet dignity that made her a favorite among traditionalists. But beneath the polished appearances, the physical toll became harder to ignore. In her later years, she suffered from arthritis and recurring respiratory issues. Her public appearances grew less frequent, her posture more rigid, her gaze more distant. She died in 1965 at the age of 67, during a walk on the grounds of the Harewood estate. The death was called peaceful, of course. They always are. Mary's story is less about drama than it is about accumulation, the slow generational layering of pain, expectation, and sedation. A woman raised to be the embodiment of calm in a world unraveling, held together not by freedom, but by protocol and pharmaceutical precision. And just as she was fading from the stage, a new kind of royal crisis was forming, not in the public sphere, but in the private world of yet another disillusioned heir. A king who abdicated, a man exiled, and a duke who may have relied on sedatives not to preserve the crown, but to forget it. His name was Edward. His drug of choice, they say, was barbiturates. 23. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. By the time Edward VIII became king, the monarchy was already in crisis. Not the kind with riots or revolts, the kind that brews quietly behind closed doors, in rooms lined with red velvet and unspoken tension. He wasn't supposed to be the problem. He was charismatic, modern, and famously handsome. Women adored him. The press fawned. He represented change, but only the kind people thought they could control. What they hadn't counted on was how little Edward cared about pretending. Not just about protocol, about everything, including eventually himself. When he abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American socialite who rendered the entire British establishment apoplectic, the headlines were swift and brutal. It was the scandal of the century, a king choosing love over duty, or, depending on who you asked, a king choosing recklessness over stability. But what followed his departure from the throne wasn't peace or romance. It was exile. And inside that exile, there was a man who had lost not just power, but purpose. Edward's years as Duke of Windsor were spent moving between borrowed homes, diplomatic dead ends, and orchestrated social appearances. He had no real political role, no fixed home, and no lasting legacy, at least not one that didn't begin and end with abdication. The crown had moved on, almost too efficiently, and he became a sort of living relic, photographed, tolerated, but never again trusted. It's in this twilight, decades after the fanfare, that the rumors start to take form, not from palace memos or medical confessions, but from the soft-focus world of biographies, letters, and the whispered accounts of society insiders. Stories of sedatives, mentions of nerves, allusions to long stretches of fatigue, unpredictable moods, and a man increasingly dependent on the quiet relief of barbiturates. By the mid-20th century, barbiturates had replaced laudanum and morphine as the drug of choice for upper-class exhaustion. They were prescribed for anxiety, insomnia, depression, all of which Edward reportedly endured, though never formally diagnosed. His use of these drugs, if it occurred, would not have been framed as abuse. It would have been seen as treatment for restlessness, melancholy, or stress, a word that carried just enough vagueness to conceal almost anything. He had plenty to be restless about. Stripped of his status, kept at arm's length from his family, and viewed as a political liability in Britain, Edward drifted. His marriage to Wallis was long but not untroubled. They were glamorous together, yes, but also lonely. Publicly devoted, but privately adrift. In many ways, Edward had traded one prison for another, and sedatives, discreetly administered by private physicians, were part of the wallpaper. Barbiturates like Seconal and Amytal were common among the European elite in the mid-20th century. Royals, film stars, and aristocrats all shared the same preference: a doctor who made house calls and a pill that guaranteed sleep. These drugs dulled anxiety, slowed the racing thoughts, and helped people forget, or at least postpone, what they didn't want to face. For someone like Edward, whose greatest regret was also the thing that defined him, forgetting must have seemed like a reasonable request. But barbiturates came with a cost: memory lapses, dependence, emotional flattening. None of these would have triggered alarm in Edward's world. Just more doses, more prescriptions, more late mornings and early cocktails. He aged into a figure of brittle nostalgia, the king who wasn't, a cautionary tale in tailored suits. He died in 1972 in Paris, far from the throne, far from the country that once debated whether he might destroy it. His legacy is still debated, romantic to some, disastrous to others. But one thing is clear: by the end, he was no longer resisting sedation. He had, perhaps, come to need it. And he wasn't the only Windsor navigating post-war life through a haze of pharmaceuticals. One royal woman, elegant, composed, and always just off stage, had her own quiet encounters with medicine, morphine this time, clinical, acceptable, administered as part of routine care. Her name was Marina, Duchess of Kent. Her prescription? Pain relief. Her reality? Managed silence. 24. Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent. Princess Marina, Duchess of Kent, arrived in Britain with the elegance of a woman born into old-world aristocracy and the resolve of someone who understood exactly what that demanded. Born a princess of Greece and Denmark in 1906, she brought European grace to the British royal family when she married Prince George, Duke of Kent, in 1934. She was glamorous, impeccably dressed, multilingual, and a royal from the old order, the kind who knew how to be watched without ever appearing to react. But behind that carefully curated composure was a body and a system, worn down by decades of quiet management, wartime duty, and a series of painful health crises that, predictably, were treated with the same tools every royal woman before her had known: morphine, administered politely. Marina wasn't made for English weather or English expectations. She had grown up among the shattered remnants of continental monarchy, where titles still carried an aura of fading magic. Her childhood was fractured by war, revolution, and exile, and by the time she entered the British royal family, she knew perfectly well how to adapt to systems that didn't ask how you felt, only how well you could endure. Endure she did. Marina performed her role with admirable precision. As Duchess of Kent, she carried out public duties, raised 3 children, and maintained an image of dignified restraint that suited the times. But that image cost something. She suffered a number of serious health issues throughout her adult life, including multiple surgeries, chronic illness, and injuries, each of which brought with it the same familiar medical answer: morphine. Often prescribed for post-operative pain and chronic conditions during the 1940s and 1950s, morphine was administered not as a last resort, but as a standard part of high society medicine, especially for royals. This wasn't addiction as chaos. It was pain management by decree. Morphine came in precise doses, often injected or administered in hospital settings, but sometimes taken orally under supervision. It was meant to maintain control, not surrender to it. And for a woman like Marina, whose public face was as polished as the crown jewels, control was everything. Doctors trusted morphine. So did patients. By mid-century, it had acquired the same cultural role laudanum once held, a respectable solution for physical agony, emotional strain, and the vague discomforts that came with age and obligation. For Marina, it likely became a constant companion in her later years, prescribed after operations and retained as a tool for managing the lingering aches of time and royal life. No headlines, no scandals, just quiet reliance. Her composure never faltered. She remained active well into her 60s, attending engagements and maintaining her public duties with the same grace that had defined her entrance into British royal life decades earlier. But those closest to her noticed the fatigue, the stiffness, the signs of someone carrying pain too deep to show. Morphine didn't erase those signs. It softened them, kept them palatable. The drug did its job. Marina died in 1968 at Kensington Palace, at the age of 61, after a long illness. The public narrative, as always, emphasized dignity and serenity. No mention was made of the medications. There never was. But the pattern was unmistakable. A royal body in decline. A quiet regime of pharmaceuticals. And a tradition of numbing pain that had become so normalized, it wasn't even noticed. She was not an addict in the way tabloids define it. She was a patient in the way monarchy requires. Never uncontrolled, never undignified, never allowed to truly suffer where anyone could see. And like so many before her, Marina passed that quiet standard of care forward. To younger royals navigating newer medical systems, facing psychiatric diagnoses that previous generations would never have spoken aloud. One of them, a princess turned nun, a mother of a prince, and a patient of 1930s psychiatry, would face not just morphine, but the full force of early barbiturates, electrotherapy, and silence. Her name was Alice. Her mystery is deeper than most. 25. Princess Alice of Battenberg. Of all the royals touched by the long shadow of dangerous drugs, few lived a life as complex, contradictory, and quietly radical as Princess Alice of Battenberg. Born in 1885 at Windsor Castle, great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria and mother of Prince Philip, the future Duke of Edinburgh, Alice's story was never meant to follow the script. She was royal by blood, but never by temperament. Deaf from birth, deeply spiritual, and fiercely independent, she moved through the palaces and salons of Europe like a ghost out of place. And when her mind began to unravel in the 1930s, the response was predictably clinical, and, as always, chemical. Princess Alice's descent into what was then termed mental illness is still wrapped in mystery, some of it medical, much of it intentional. By the early 1930s, after years of personal hardship, spiritual revelations, and emotional turmoil, she began displaying signs of what doctors at the time labeled paranoid psychosis. She was convinced she had a divine calling, believed she was receiving messages from God, and began behaving in ways the royal family couldn't tolerate and the medical establishment couldn't explain. What followed was not compassion. It was containment. In 1930, she was forcibly removed from her family and institutionalized in a Swiss sanatorium. Her husband, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, left. Her children were scattered, and Alice, once a queen-in-waiting, found herself a patient in the hands of European psychiatrists, experimenting with the most modern and the most dangerous tools available. At the heart of her treatment was barbiturate sedation. Barbiturates, central nervous system depressants used widely from the early 20th century onward, were prescribed for a wide range of conditions: insomnia, anxiety, mania, nervous disorders, and increasingly for those who couldn't or wouldn't conform to social norms. In Alice's case, doctors used them to induce calm, to blunt emotion and to control behavior. They were given under the guise of therapy, often in combination with other experimental procedures, including, reportedly, electroconvulsive therapy. There was no informed consent. Royal or not, Alice had no say. Barbiturates like phenobarbital and amobarbital were administered in doses that dulled her senses and sedated her defiance. These were not recreational drugs. They were tools of medical discipline applied in the name of restoring normalcy. But what they really did was erase the parts of Alice that didn't fit: her visions, her spirituality, her grief. And yet, astonishingly, she survived it. After years in institutional care, she was released in the mid-1930s against her doctor's advice. She reunited briefly with her family, but remained estranged from her children. And then, in a move that shocked nearly everyone who knew her, she reinvented herself entirely. Alice returned to Greece, embraced Orthodox Christianity, and founded a nursing order of nuns, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. During World War II, she sheltered Jewish families in her home in Athens, defying Nazi occupiers while dressed in religious robes. She lived in poverty, refused royal stipends, and remained committed to service until the end of her life. But the barbiturates never entirely left her story. Even in later years, as her health declined, doctors continued to prescribe sedatives to manage what they delicately called her nerves. The drugs changed names, the doses grew smaller, but the logic remained: soothe, silence, contain. Alice, the mystic, the rebel, the patient, was never quite allowed to be fully understood. She died at Buckingham Palace in 1969, penniless, by choice, having asked to be buried in Jerusalem, a final act of spiritual defiance. Her body was eventually moved there, years after her death. Alice's story is the end of the royal pharmacopoeia as we've traced it, from laudanum-soaked queens to morphine-laced monarchs to barbiturate-sedated princesses. Her life holds all the contradictions of monarchy and medicine: power and helplessness, dignity and sedation, silence and survival. She wasn't addicted to a drug. She was subjected to it, and in that way, she was no different from the rest.